in college, I was seriously thinking about a seminary and become a Catholic priest. I had the secret, which was that I was gay.
What is conversion therapy?
Historically, these practices have been pretty gruesome and physically violent. They've included things like lobotomies, shock therapies, and other aversion techniques where they would... I was born and raised in Canada, raised mainly in Toronto, growing up, and, son of immigrants from Hong Kong, and had in many ways a pretty normal upbringing. I think defining things was religion and faith were something that I was raised with, but not particularly in a deep or quite serious way. It was something that we would occasionally go to church and I was baptized as a Catholic, but that was not something that was terribly prominent in my upbringing. One of the things that made me gravitate towards faith and towards religion was the fact that I was bullied quite severely as a child, and found God to be this kind of refuge and friend that allowed me to, feel like safe. And so based on that background, I ended up growing up and taking my religion more and more seriously, to the point that in college I was seriously thinking about and discerning to join the seminary and become a Catholic priest. And that was something that I really seriously pursued. I had a spiritual director, which is kind of like a priest that you meet with regularly to talk about your vocation and kind of discern whether or not this is your path. And I was pretty much on that path. However, I had the secret, which was that I was gay, and that I, hadn't quite at all, really come to terms with it, but it was something that I felt was, and not just felt, was told that would be an obstacle towards me becoming a priest. And so I ended up spending most of my 20s trying to change my sexual orientation through various forms of conversion therapy, which we can talk about. And that endeavor, was long and really shaped me from, even now. And so fast forward to 2019, I was living in the Bay Area at the time, and I came across on my newsfeed, I was in a coffee shop and came across the news story of this young woman who had gone missing and had died by suicide at the age of 24 from Boulder, Colorado. And the more I read about her story, the more my blood froze. I was like, this is so uncanny. This was a young woman who had dreamed of becoming a nun since she was a young teenager, who was very devout, was this like A+ student, athlete, ultimate Frisbee champ, artist, made her own fashion and clothing, was just this like vibrant person. But she also shared the secret around her sexuality. And at 14, when she came out to her priest, he advised her to not to tell her parents about it. And some of the guidance that she got from other people and spiritual leaders in her life in the Catholic Church directed her towards conversion therapy, which she pursued for about 2 years. And her family, in the news articles, really believed that played a role in her demise. And I was just like completely frozen because my blood was cold. I was just like, this is so familiar. I feel like I can relate to a lot of these elements in the story. And so I continued to look online to read whatever I could, and eventually came across a Facebook post that her mother had written that shared a little bit more detail about Alana's life and some of the influences she received. And I immediately recognized a lot of the community, the church community that she was a part of. There's a very interesting conservative subculture within American Catholicism that she and I were very active in. And so I ended up reaching out to Alana's mother, just emailing her and sending her a note of condolence and sharing a little bit of my own story. And that began a few months later. We ended up connecting on the phone, and that began, for the next year and a half, just a phone and texting relationship where I got to know a little bit more. And her mother was asking so many questions, and I just kind of got drawn into the story.
Okay, I have some questions.
Yeah.
So one question is, you said the Bay Area, you mean San Francisco? Because I live in Tampa, Florida, and they call Tampa, they call the Bay Area also. So, okay, San Francisco.
Yeah. San Francisco, yeah.
And what were you doing? You're saying, I mean, you went from Canada to, how did you get to San Francisco, and what were you doing there at that time?
Yeah.
When you came across
So
the story?
it was several steps. So I went from Canada, I graduated from college, and then I moved to New York City, which is where I started working in Catholic media. And that's when I began my years in conversion therapy there, seeking out a therapist, going to group therapy, doing all sorts of church programs as well. And I think part of my move to New York was like consciously actually to seek out the kinds of therapies that I had been reading about online, that promised to be able to change my sexual orientation. And so I ended up kind of I spent 6 years in New York, and that persisted as the conversion therapy persisted throughout the whole time I was there. And then I ended up getting a job out in the Bay Area in tech, which was kind of the job and career path I eventually found myself on, and moved out to San Francisco and continued to, even though I wasn't in formal therapy, continued to try to apply a lot of the techniques and approaches that I had been learning on my own. And it was at that point that I came across Alana's story.
My question is, one, as a priest, or a nun, like you're not engaging in sexual relationships. So I don't understand why it would matter if your orientation was to be heterosexual or gay. Why would that even be an issue if you said, hey, I want to become a priest? Like you're throwing all that to the side anyway. So why would that be an issue? So that's one question. I have another question.
Yeah. Yeah. So I believe it was in the late 80s that the Vatican released a document that really described actually, no, this was more recent than that. This was in the 2000s. The Vatican released a document that talked about how, what were the prerequisites for admission into seminaries for people to study to become priests. And there was a lot of space given to talk about homosexuality and whether or not that was a disqualifier. And the answer was that if this was considered a deep-seated experience or identity that one felt, that was disqualifying. And the reasons behind all of that are complicated. I think that there is a certain view that some people hold in the church around, and this has to do with a lot of the narratives undergirding conversion therapy, but the idea that a person who's gay is somehow less whole as a person, like that they have some sort of pathology about them that that makes them unfit to be like a spiritual father, or to be like a full, like in my case, like a man, like a full-blown man, like that idea that homosexuality is this pathology or developmental hindrance or delay that is rooted in a lot of these conversion therapy narratives that really influenced some of these Vatican documents that felt like that basically conveyed the idea that if you had this condition, that you were debilitated, and that even though you may not be you're technically supposed to be celibate, you are somehow debilitated in some spiritual uh, developmental way that prevents you from being able to be this kind of spiritual leader in the
Okay.
church. So I think that's a big reason.
I was gonna say that seems odd to me, because to me, gay men are more nurturing than a typical man, and the experiences that I've had with priests are that's really their role, is kind of to be somebody that help guide you and that you can confide in and will give you good advice, and somebody that you don't have to, somebody that you can really be honest with, but so that's
Yeah.
odd. But what I was thinking was that it was maybe almost like an aptitude. For example, if you go into, let's say, the insurance field, there's sometimes you'll, or any job, that doesn't matter. Mine happens to be in insurance, where this happens, where lots of job fields do this, where they give you an aptitude test, and they go out and they find their most successful, let's say, insurance adjusters. They ask them, hundreds of questions, and they come up with an aptitude test that says, hey, if like somebody who scores in this range has a higher aptitude to become an adjuster and stay an adjuster with this company. Someone in this range has less likelihood. And that as a priest, you don't, I was thinking more like, we're looking for these types of people with these types of characteristics and not these types of characteristics, because they have a higher aptitude to become priests and stay priests. So I thought maybe the church had come up with part of the aptitude, or their criteria they were looking at was, they were thinking to themselves, well, we've had priests in the past that have had, well, whatever, were gay, and they didn't stay priests for long. Maybe it was something like that, not,
No, I think the reality is that, in my experience, at least, and I think the experience of a lot of Catholics, especially in the West, is most priests are gay. They actually, whether they admit it or not, or are closeted, or would use that language to describe their orientation. And I think the church has really relied on a lot of gay men and women historically to serve its ranks. However, I think the complexity of where we are today has a lot to do not only with the theology undergirding, the church's teaching on homosexuality, but also like the political context we're in, like the fact that being gay is now something quite generally acceptable and open, and people are, developing vocabulary and are active politically and advocating for rights in those areas, is something that is still fairly scary and new for the church. And I think that those general political skirmishes that we see reflected in the American culture wars generally are reflected in the Catholic Church, and particularly the American Catholic Church, and are almost indistinguishable. And so some of those same debates that we see online about gay rights and about whether or not gay people are fully functioning people or not, generally play out in the church as well, and the church is not immune from that. And so I think that that has a lot to do with like how these documents get written. There's lots of interesting history behind some of the authors of some of these documents, who if you dig a little bit deeper, will discover are actually closeted gay men themselves who've had a history of abusing others. It's actually quite dark and also not surprising, right? Like typically the people that are the most vociferous about these issues are generally compensating for something in some way in their life.
Yeah, it's always the guy yelling loudest. It's always the guy yelling loudest about it and complaining the most. It's like,
yeah, exactly.
I was going to say that basically large organizations or bureaucracies tend to be the ones to adopt, new things last. It takes them a much longer period of time to say, okay, this is an overwhelming, this isn't something that's a trend and it's going to go away. This is entered into the culture. And as a result, we're going to go ahead and have to adopt this in some fashion. But I was saying in
Yeah.
general, just even priests in general, that whole system that they came up with it's just difficult. It's a bad situation. It's you know what I mean? Like, you have to give up so much to be a priest. I mean, you really do.
Hmm.
So the people that are
Yeah.
willing to give up all of that have something else going on, maybe. I would say the bulk of them do.
Yeah.
Very seldom is someone born, go to church, love it so much, decide they're going to give up everything and just dedicate their life to the church. Like, that's a tall order.
Yeah.
That's tough.
And yet that was exactly the kind of life I envisioned for myself, and that Alana Chen, also envisioned for herself. Like, she had dreamed of becoming a nun, was fascinated by that way of life, and really felt compelled to devote her life to serving the poor as a nun. Like, she had already been volunteering actively in Boulder and Denver with the homeless population, and was like, serving under the bridge and sometimes skipping class to do that. Like, she was very active in and felt very called to that kind of life of service. And I think a lot of people have that gift, whether that's religious or not, right? Like, that is something that they feel called to serve. And and you're right, it is unique. But I think, yeah, when there's a narrative around it, which was the case in our cases around this being our path towards God, I think that's where the stakes become much higher, and it becomes, um, you know, for us at least, it felt like, uh, and again, I think as we get into Alana's story, Alana left behind 20 journals in her bedroom, which were found by her family, and that's really the basis of the material for Dear Alana, the podcast, because I was able to read them and really get to know her and her inner life, and from that I really discovered that she really felt like this was her calling and her path, and she really felt like in order to be able to follow this path in the most pure way possible, she had to change. She had to get rid of this, what she was taught was this sort of pathology and disease.
Well, so we kind of left off where you had started communicating with her mother.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
I started communicating with her mother, and this was before I had any idea to do any kind of documentary about this. It was just purely, I wanted to offer support. I wanted to, you know, um, just be able to help her as she was grieving, and provide as any context that I could, based on my own experience of some of these things that her daughter had gone through. And so I, we continued that kind of phone and texting relationship, and uh, it at a certain point, this was in 2021, I had just quit my job. I had burned out. It was post COVID. I needed a little bit of a break, and I had uh, gone back home to my family in Toronto, and just to crash a little bit. And I was lying awake in bed. It was 2 a.m. and Alana's story just kept on haunting me. It was like I felt like there was so much that I still didn't know about what happened to her, but that from what I had known, it felt like there was a lot that really overlapped with my own life, with my own experiences, that I wanted to investigate, and to help her family as well, like learn more about. Um and so this idea to like document this process in audio came very vividly at that time, in the middle of the night. It was like, I think audio could be a great way to capture someone's inner thoughts, these really delicate, vulnerable questions that this young person had as she was coming of age. And I kind of had this idea to really explore some of the big themes around identity, around coming of age, around belonging, around like, you know, finding one's path, and the prices that we might pay, the price we might pay to find that belonging. And so the next day I ended up, you know, writing to her family and their attorney, and I just got on a Zoom and said, hey, like, what do you think if I investigated, you know, Alana's life and death, and captured it in an audio documentary and a podcast? And
But
they were
you don't have any
immediately
experience.
supportive.
You don't have any
I don't.
experience doing
No.
it, right? Oh,
No.
yeah. I was going to say I
Zero
haven't heard
experience. I
anyone
had, you
say.
know, yeah, I had my background early on was in Catholic media, and we made a documentary with this
Okay, well
company,
that's
but you
something.
know, that was, yeah, but that was quite a while ago, um and I just, but I just felt really strongly. I had this pretty vivid idea of like how I wanted this to feel and to sound, um and so I pitched it to them, and I had no background in audio, called anyone I knew who had any kind of connection to the audio industry, got a list of equipment that I was, you know, and what was funny is I was so thrifty that, you know, because I was in Canada at the time, I waited, and I actually had Amazon Prime deliver the mic equipment um, to the friend's basement that I was staying in Denver, um, for my first trip out to meet her family. And so so the night before meeting Alana's mother, which is captured in the first episode, I'm watching YouTube tutorials on how to like figure out how to use this mic and hold it properly and all of that. And ended up figuring it out. And that was my first time meeting Alana's family in person, was that fall. So that was like the beginnings of me collecting material and learning little bit more about Alana, like kind of figuring out the timeline, you know, talking to people, following the leads, really trying to understand, yeah, trying to understand what happened to her, and what was it like, and um, ended up producing a pilot, pitched it, was still, you know, not sure how I was self-funding this at the time, and um, basically ended up finding a collaborator, a producer who happened to live in Boulder, and who was very much intrigued by the story. And I made the decision about a year later, after flying back and forth to Boulder and Denver to interview folks, to move to Denver full time to just work on this, because it was getting too, you know, onerous to keep flying back and forth. And by doing that, it actually like opened up so many more details about the story. I think by being there, I was able to learn more about these journals, and actually, I think that the trust that was developed between myself and Alana's mother allowed me to have access to them and read and scan every page, and so that really, you know, opened up so much more about the story, because I got to hear from Alana's own words what she'd been going through. And I think what you'll see in the story, and what ended up happening is, as I was telling Alana's story, I kind of got swept up in it myself. We had made 3 episodes and had started getting feedback from listeners, just to like, you know, see what they felt about the story, and had, you know, any questions they might have. And the refrain was like, who is Simon? Like, why is he telling the story? Like, what's his background? And so I ended up, you know, backing into sharing my own story and the parallels. And I had also kept journals throughout all, you know, my adolescence, and all of that. Some sort of the weaving between Alana's story and my own became the basis of this dual narrative, of this documentary.
So, what is conversion therapy? What is it based on? You know, based on like what is the, you know, what is the premise and the practice of trying to convert somebody?
Sure. So Conversion therapy is a big umbrella term to describe practices that are meant to try to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. And historically, these practices have been pretty gruesome and physically violent. They've included things like lobotomies, shock therapies, and other aversion techniques where they would, you know, induce like nausea in patients as they were looking at images of men or women, and that was kind of the idea. Those were some of the early practices, but eventually, with the advent of Freud and psychoanalysis, there became a new branch of conversion therapy that was really trying to take Freud's ideas, which were groundbreaking at the time, which is the idea that we developmentally become who we are because of the early childhood relationship with our parents. So either a trauma or some sort of unresolved issue with our parents is kind of the reason why we are the way we are as adults. And so the work of his psychoanalytic approach was to try to kind of detangle or deconstruct some of these childhood experiences and recover from some of these traumas with our parents. But a lot of people took Freud's ideas and applied them to sexuality. And so you have in the 50s onwards, people developing theories around why people are gay and kind of the overarching theories at the time really centered on for men, a bad relationship with the father that resulted in the boy essentially like disconnecting from his own sense of masculinity. And so the idea is that at puberty, this boy who has this deficit in masculine, in his own sense of masculinity, ends up experiencing this deficit as a sort of attraction and a sexual attraction towards members of the same sex. And so homosexuality was seen as this developmental blip that, that people weren't actually gay. Everyone was actually heterosexual. Just some people got some sort of trauma or had some sort of stunted experience that made them gay, but that it would be temporary if they could resolve some of those underlying issues. People expanded those parental ideas to include peers. So, if you were bullied as a boy, that ended up, as a boy making you disconnect from your sense of masculinity as a peer of other boys. And so you ended up, again, like sexualizing that need at puberty subconsciously, and then that's why you're gay. And the similar sort of inverse of that applies to women and their mothers. And so that narrative really persisted, and a lot of therapists developed practices around talk therapy and around trying to get to quote unquote the root of one's sexual orientation and the traumas that caused it. And as that was happening, a lot of religious organizations and ministries started to develop parallel practices based on a lot of these ideas, but with a sort of spiritual lens. So, it wasn't just that you were traumatized as a child with your father or with your peers. There's some spiritual reason for why you were damaged in this way, and it has to do with the fall and sort of spiritual brokenness. And so by applying spiritual remedies, you could also be healed, quote unquote, from this condition. But at the root of it, the idea, which was really dominant at the time up until the 70s, when the APA removed homosexuality from its list of psychological disorders, is the idea that homosexuality is a psychological disorder, right? Is the idea that it's a pathology, it's a disease, something that you can therefore cure, because a disease is something that you should be able to, change or cure from. And a lot of these practices and a lot of these organizations and groups that have developed these conversion therapy practices continue today. And so I went through my forms of conversion therapy with a psychotherapist and with in a group setting in the mid 2000s, right? Alana experienced this in a decade later. And what's interesting is that, you know, over time, groups like the APA have really come out against conversion therapy because they found no efficacy, no basis for efficacy of these practices in changing orientation. The largest Christian, what's called ex-gay or conversion therapy referral network, shut down in 2012, like a decade ago, because it realized it wasn't working. And yet, the narrative, behind conversion therapy, the ideas, some of the practices, and therapists who are really still practicing conversion therapy still persists today. So even though conversion therapy is banned in over half of the states, it's still practiced, and often underground.
So, so when you went through it, were your parents aware? And did you explain, like, what was that conversation like? And did Elena do it on her own? Because initially you had said that she was told to keep this from her parents. Was she doing this on her own, or did she tell her parents, and her parents, said, okay, let's try this? How did that go with you and her?
Yeah. So for Alana, she did it on her own. Her parents didn't know. She pursued this, in secret. And again, this was in service of her following her dream of becoming a nun. She felt like she could get rid of this and then move on and pursue that path, her religious path. In my case, I had found information about conversion therapy when I was starting to come to grips with the fact that I might be gay. And when I actually came out to my parents, I basically said, Mom and Dad, I struggle with same-sex attraction, which is kind of the language that a lot of conservative-minded folks will typically use rather than gay, because it's seen as this kind of like clinical term.
Right.
And I said, but I'm going to change. And I've found these programs and I'm going to pursue them. And so my parents they didn't really know what to think. I think they were just like shocked at all of this, and they were supportive, but they weren't pushing me either way to do anything. It was all sort of self-initiated, similar to Alana's case.
Yeah, I always love the guys that will go to their parents and tell them, expecting this to be a huge issue, and they're like, "Yeah, we kind of saw that coming."
Yeah.
It's like, "Oh, okay." So at that point, you pursued, you started pursuing this. I mean, and you said in a group setting. What are they going over? What are they trying to? I don't understand. Like, what are you going over during these sessions?
Yeah,
In
so
general, you don't have
I
to.
pursued. Yeah, so my therapy was both one-on-one with a Catholic therapist, as well as in a group setting with other young men in their early 20s. And the idea behind, as I mentioned, the theory behind conversion therapy is that they want to help you figure out why you're gay, and so that means identifying what they believe to be the sort of triggering trauma in your life, whether that's with your father or with your peers, and it is that by working through those traumas, you can reintegrate your sense of masculinity. So, for example, in my case, like I was bullied, right? That's just a fact. That was something that happened to me when I was young, and it happened to be by the other boys in my class. And some of the like therapeutic approaches there are to, at least for example, in the group setting, was to relive some of those moments of bullying and reenact those experiences and come up with a new narrative around how I might have fought back, or how I might have been able to, see myself not as the victim in that situation, and also connect like the things that I found attractive about men to some of those traumatic experiences. So, for example, we would do an exercise where we would have a person from the group stand in front of us, and they would represent someone that from our memory, whether it was that day or week on the subway or whatever, that we found attractive, and we would have to describe the characteristics of that person that we found attractive. So for example, that person has like really beautiful hands, and so what was it? But then the exercise and the work would be trying to deconstruct what was it about this person's hands that were connected to some childhood trauma. So it was like, oh, maybe when I was like punched by that person, that hand represented the sort of connection I was looking for. And so because of that unresolved trauma, I've sort of like found this person's hands attractive because they sort of reminded me of that bully's hands or whatever, right? Like that was the kind of mental work that we were encouraged to do in order to, and the idea would be that we would then, by identifying the cause, we would then be able to create a new narrative around it, either find some new way of thinking about how, this thing that I was looking in this other person, I now no longer need to find because I've integrated this part in me. We were encouraged, for example, take up a sport as a way to kind of heal from and recreate new narratives around, some of these traumas that we might have experienced on the schoolyard. Again, the idea was to be able to rewrite. I chose judo. Yeah, okay. I chose martial art, judo, and I was so bad at it. I did it for about, I think, 2 years, and I was just showing up every week to be like thrown on the mat, and I was so bad that they would pair me up with usually like the middle-aged woman or the 11-year-old kid, because I was so bad at it, and yet I felt like I was like so eagerly, trying to get good at the sport in order to, quote unquote, heal from this trauma of being bullied on the schoolyard. And yeah, I think the other part of the theory behind it, it sounds kind of stereotypical, but it's true, is this idea that you need to learn how to be a man. You need to learn how to be masculine. You need to learn how to do those things that you missed out on as a child for whatever reason. Either you had a bad relationship with your father, or your peers shunned you. And so that resulted in, things like taking up a sport, and it resulted in talking about how we should stand and sit, and how we should talk, and kind of like talking about how as men, men. Like I remember my therapist would sit me down and say, okay, we're gonna do some sparring verbally, because the way straight men connect with each other is by insulting each other. So we're just going to insult each other for the next period. And he would just like hurl these insults. I mean, I was so uncomfortable about it. I was like, I didn't, I was just like I didn't want to like make fun of this guy. Like it was not fun to me. But yet I was like trying to do that. Yeah. And that was, some of the quote unquote work that we were doing in order to, be a man. Yeah.
Heal. Yeah. I was going to say, my wife, I genuinely think my wife could take me in a fair fight. So I don't want you to feel bad that you were paired with the 11-year-old kid, because my wife and I wrestle every once in a while, and she has insane strength. I mean, she's 125 pounds, and she is extremely, and I'm like a $180. I'm a $185. I need to lose about 10 pounds. But the point is, she's super strong, and we work out, and I'm 2-3 times as strong as her in upper body strength, where I'm a little stronger than her in the legs, but she is super, super strong. And I mean, genuinely, there have been times I've just thought that I just don't think I can take her. I don't think I can take her. And I mean, she's just that strong. So I don't want you to feel bad, because I'm on the side. Yeah. I'm at that same, that's I have that same issue with when it comes to the whole, wrestling, fighting thing. She grew up with brothers. Like, she has a leg up on me. It's not my fault. She has a leg up. She's brutal upbringing.
But what's interesting is that, like, I feel, I think what I learned later on, many, many years later, is that like a lot of people had similar experiences, whether it was, yeah, like maybe not being able to win at a fight, or having a pretty, strained relationship with their father, or maybe being bullied. Like these are very common childhood experiences for a lot of people. And yet, um, somehow, like, that was the basis for this explanation for why I was gay, and it was never the explanation for why someone was straight, right? Like, it was
Right.
always sort of like the kind of the 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 scapegoat here. But I think what's interesting is that, like, and I think what makes conversion therapy, which continues to be practiced today, so compelling, is that, like, a lot of young people are in cultures and communities where, um, like, they really feel like they have no choice. Like, they really feel like this is the only path for them to be able to fit into their community and to follow the paths that are laid out to them within their communities. And B, I think it's also compelling because, as you probably hear me talk about these theories, like, there's something kind of, like, intriguing or, like, rational about that. Like, it's like, oh, I could see how maybe that might be why this person turned out the way they did. Like, and in my case, it was like, it really drew from experiences that I had gone through, whether it was, my relationship with my father, or, being bullied. Like, those were real experiences, and it was able to sort of create a narrative around that. And I think that is also why it can be really compelling for people who choose to pursue these practices.
So with Elena, what happened? Like what I mean, she had, you had the journals, and there must have been,
Yeah.
like, very seldomly do I think that someone just suddenly makes a decision, hey, I'm going to end this. Like, I can't go on. I mean, there had to have been an
Yeah.
internal struggle there for a long time. I mean, maybe it was a short time. I don't know, but I would think, for me, I can't even imagine it. So to me, it would have had to have been a long, something dramatic, and there would have had to have been a lot of internal discussions for me to come to the conclusion that this is my way out of, of
Yeah.
this situation. Like, so I'm wondering, were those things that she, described in her journal?
Yeah, I
Journals?
mean, the podcast really goes into her journals, and into really the last decade of her life. Um and it's complicated. It's complicated. She um on the one hand, she found a lot of comfort and uh a lot of sense of belonging and identity in her religious community, which she became very active in as a young teenager, and even more so as she entered college. She really had a deep friendship and connection to her spiritual mentors, like her priests, and some of the nuns in her life. Um, and the church community that she was in was just a big part of her life. It was kind of her friend group. It was where she, spent her time in service. Like, it was a big part of her adolescence. Um, at the same time, there were there was the secret that she was harboring. Nobody knew she was gay. This was something that she was told to keep a secret from her family, which she did. And I think the show kind of explores what kind of a psychic toll that can have on a person when they have to live this kind of dual life, where they appear one way but have, this thing that they can't talk to anyone about. And what it's like when you are kind of taught that you have this pathology, you have this sort of quote unquote disease, right? That you need to be healed and cure from. And I mean, there's so much that happens, and I think this is why the podcast is the length that it is, because there's there are things that happened in Alana's life that, um, whether it was having several suicide attempts, whether it was falling in love for the first time, whether it was um, feeling abandoned by her community as she started to question some of the things that she was taught. And there's a lot that I think we lay out that she talks about and writes about that gives us clues, as to what happened to her and how this ended up having such a damaging toll on her mental health. She struggled a lot with depression and anxiety, and towards the end of her life, really felt kind of traumatized by some of the same places that she used to find a lot of comfort in, whether that was her, friend group or her church. So I think like the show really tries to present a truthful and accurate and sort of bigger picture of what she had gone through, um and I think that a lot of people will be able to relate to some of her struggles, even if not in the particulars, in the like sense of like wanting to find belonging, wanting to, you know, uh, taking the great lengths that she did in order to find that. Um, and and I think that her vulnerability in her journals is kind of the gift that she left. She left the world because a lot of people have, who have listened to it have really been able to relate and feel like just not alone in their struggles.
So what ultimately happened? You had said that she went missing, but she was missing, and
Yeah.
then what happened? And do you specifically know what led up to that, or it was just you feel like the conversion therapy was just doing her psyche extreme damage to the point where you feel like she, what do you think? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think that like, I don't think we'll ever really know, because it's rarely one sort of trigger. The more I've learned about, um, suicide, like the more I have learned that it's not it's this sort of cumulative effect, and a person can, in a moment of weakness, really give up, and that's just, it's so fragile in that way. But um I think that, like, you know I mean, really, the nuts and bolts of what ended up happening to her is that she had already had several suicide attempts and scares in the years leading up to her death. And at the same time, she was kind of in every single kind of treatment program you could think of, whether it was, one-on-one therapy, support groups that were just trying to, help her stabilize and come to a place of managing a lot of her depression and anxiety. And but one evening, or late afternoon, in December of 2019, she said she was going to go hiking, and which was typical, something that she always would do. And she left, and um, basically would never return. And as the days passed and search parties were sent to look for her, friends and family were driving all around every place that they could imagine. It became increasingly bleak, and eventually she was found. She was found at a reservoir about an hour from Boulder, and that was the coroner ruled her death to be a suicide. And um, that yeah, that was how things ended. And yeah, and I think that I don't want to give too much away, because so much of the podcast really tries to present as much information as possible so that people can, um, so that we can sort of, in many ways, just begin to speculate about what happened. But I think that a big component of it, for sure, was the years of the kind of education that she was receiving about herself, and that really, yeah, that ended up creating a really constricted place for her to not be able to imagine a future for herself, and that was the tragedy in all this.
So her so she'd had suicide attempts, and her parents knew there were suicide attempts, but she
Hmm.
had,
Yeah.
even though I'm sure they had conversations about it, she never told them that she was gay. She just,
Eventually she did. Eventually she
oh,
did. So
okay.
that was something that kind of came out in the last few years of her life. And, um, they shortly before one of her suicide scares, she'd come out to her mother and told her kind of what had been happening, the therapy she had been going to, the ways in which she was trying to manage all of that. Um, and after that first suicide scare, her family really went into high drive. She was in um, various live-in programs for months at a time in order to help to try to stabilize her condition, and help her develop some of those coping mechanisms. And so I think the tragedy
Coping
is that
mechanisms, coping mechanisms geared toward stabilizing her suicide attempts, or toward
yeah.
conversion therapy.
No, she had stopped seeing a
Okay.
therapist, the conversion therapist at that point. But yeah, it was more about managing her anxiety and depression. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, because I was thinking that she had never told her parents, and that her parents found out later by reading her journals or something. Maybe that's how they found out that she was gay. And I was thinking that would have been crushing, that she felt that, yeah, as a parent, to think,
Yeah.
wow, she didn't feel she could confide in us. And, so at least her parents, at least at least they knew, and they were able to kind of, put an effort in. And they, I mean, that should have alleviated some of the, because I mean, parents will feel guilty, whether whether they should feel guilty or not. They just naturally,
Yeah.
people, through the grieving process, it's the whole, what did I do? Was it me? You go through that. What could I have done? I
Yeah.
would have do anything to change this, that the whole steps of grieving. And I was thinking, well, at least they didn't find that out and then think, wow, that's, that we, had we only been more approachable. But luckily she was able to. And it sounds like she didn't approach them to begin with, really, because she was getting that kind of advice from her, her spiritual, or, the priests and other people were telling her, well,
Yeah.
don't mention it, which is really strange to say, to keep something like that from your parents, to keep anything from your,
Yeah.
but,
I think that's one of the most egregious things in this whole story, I think. And I talk a bit about how that kind of advice is not surprising in these kind of church environments, often because the person who's counseling this young person might fear that the parents or the community or family might affirm their sexual orientation, might affirm them in being gay, and that would sort of go against their religious convictions, and that therefore is something that you should keep from them because you want to um, keep this person on the straight and narrow. And I think, like, that's potentially one reason why that was the advice given. The other interesting advice, the other potential reason, I'd say, is that again, per a lot of these conversion therapy narratives, which really have a deep chokehold um, on a lot of these religious communities, is like this idea that, so this is something that you can grow out of, right? Because this is something that is temporary and is curable. If you identify with this too early on, then you might sort of lock it in. And so instead, if we can sort of work through it and quote unquote cure you, then you don't need to um like you don't need to tell anyone. You don't need, no one needs to know about this. And then thirdly, I think there's just a lot of shame that is associated with being gay that certainly silence makes worse, but it is seen as this kind of like, don't talk about this with anyone. Like, no, this is so shameful, and it's something that you and I can work on together and root out, and then you can move on with your life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so when did you start the podcast, and where is it? Like, how did that go about? You pitched it, it got picked up, and then you went ahead and started producing podcasts. How many are there, by the way?
So it's right now it's 8 episodes. We have a bonus episode. We might have a few more coming out soon, but the process of making Dear Alana was arduous, also because I didn't know what I was doing. It was my first time going through this process. And so, partnering with Tenderfoot TV, who ended up producing the show, was a big step. And, that was the connection there was made through a former coworker and friend who had been working at Tenderfoot and had heard my pilot and was like, we should, brought it to Tenderfoot to consider as being part of their slate. And they loved it. And so I ended up working with Tenderfoot to produce the rest of the show. And when and it was a small group of people. It was myself, my producer and composer Lori, and Donald, the CEO of Tenderfoot, and essentially the three of us made it. It was a very intimate experience, and intentionally so. I felt like I was touching on topics and revealing things about both Alana's life and my own that were just so sensitive that the room needed to be small, and they were very respectful of that. And I think you'll hear that kind of intimacy and vulnerability in the show. And the podcast released this August. It debuted at #1 on Apple Podcasts within its first week. In its first month, it had over 1 million downloads. And so, it was kind of shocking how much it took off and how much it continues to. I've heard from so many people, hundreds of people at this point, that have reached out to share kind of like their own experiences, either of conversion therapy or of growing up, gay or queer in religious settings. I've heard from people, interestingly, the wives of gay men who they're now in the process of separating from, who had been secretly going through these kinds of therapies as well, and that they now understood more, what was going on. And I've heard also from people that just have like no connection to these topics and just have been really moved by the kind of human story that this is telling around, young people growing up and trying to find their place in the world. And so it's really resonated. And I'm still kind of getting used to this sort of public vulnerability that this podcast has brought out.
Do you interview Alana's friends or her parents? Is it that type of documentary style?
Yeah. So I talked to I talked to anyone who would talk to me that knew Alana. So her closest friends, her siblings, her parents, and I end up. What's interesting is like the story is so personal, not only because of like the commonalities between Alana and me, but also because like I am like 1 degree separated from, and in many ways, like basically Facebook friends with some of the people that counseled Alana. So like I know people that were Alana's spiritual mentors, and so I really tried my best to get interviews with some of these folks as well, was turned down. But I, was trying to use that personal network as well to be able to reach those who counseled Alana as she was growing up, and I talk a bit about that subculture of Catholicism that we were a part of, and so by moving there, spending a lot of time with her network, and in getting to know people that knew her, all of that is captured in the podcast.
Okay. Well, when's your bonus episode coming out?
So we already have one bonus episode. It's with a psychotherapist who specializes in trauma and is able to provide kind of that clinical perspective on some of the themes of the show. And we're still cooking a few others, and so those are TBD as for in terms of their release. But you can listen to the show in its entirety now. It's available. It was just chosen by Apple as its one of 12 of their favorite shows of 2023. So if you go on Apple Podcasts, it's sort of in that carousel of shows right now. So really proud of the impact that it's had, and hope that it continues to get out there.
Well, I mean, what are you planning on doing now? Are you planning on, so obviously this is kind of, a different, venture for you. And you've had success at it. You're going to go back in the tech industry, or are you thinking, no, I've got a taste for this. I've got to turn this into something. I'm going to got another story. Or have you thought that far in advance?
Yeah, I haven't thought that far. Right now, I've spent the rest of this year just continuing to do press around Dear Alana and kind of recovering and resting, and kind of reached that finish line of releasing it, and was kind of just on empty. And so I've been just trying to refill my cup. But I know I have some more stories in me that that touch on similar themes or not. And I do feel like audio as a medium has been really, really fun. It's been an amazing, amazing way to tell stories. And I'd love to continue doing that.
Okay. Well, how do you feel about this? Are you feel like we wrap it up? We got everything?
Yeah.
Do you have anything else you want to say or talk about or touch on? You're good?
No, I mean, I think, if folks can listen to Dear Alana, go to dearalana.com. And there have been numerous other interviews I've done on the subject from a variety of perspectives, whether that's the my own personal story, or talking more about Alana and her experiences, coming from more religious perspectives as well. So there's different angles that you can hear, and just encourage folks to listen and to share.
Hey, if you guys like the episode, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you get notified of videos just like this. Please consider joining my Patreon. It really helps me with bringing this type of content. Also, please check the description box for all of the links that we just discussed. Leave me a comment. Thank you very much. See ya.